Today we're going to be speaking about ad fraud, a few ways to detect it and how to prevent it. And I wanted to get a general feeling from the audience here today. If anybody has heard about advertising fraud, if you could, leave a comment in the chat, just saying like I have, or yes, something like this, it would really help us actually gauge some of the content that we'll be discussing today. Maybe it's a new topic for most of the audience. Okay, I see Samantha says yes. Okay, perfect. I see some people interacting. Great, thanks for providing some input here. So actually, before we get into it, I wanted to present to you myself. I'm Eduardo, I'm CEO at Opticks, and with me today there's also Mark Rubia. Mark Rubia is the R&D lead at Opticks, so he's a very knowledgeable person to help us in explaining and generating awareness with everything that has to do with ad fraud. Very quickly, so that you get an idea of who we are. Opticks, we are a Southern European company based in Barcelona, and we do ad fraud detection and prevention solutions to some of the leading brands worldwide. A few logos here, but let's get into the agenda today. Today we'd like to discuss, what is ad fraud? What we consider ad fraud. We're going to be seeing who's affected and how, a few famous examples, and then we'll get into how can companies at different levels detect it and prevent it. So first thing is, what is ad fraud? Ad fraud is actually the most prevalent cybercrime globally, and of course we know it, but there's also a third party saying that, such as Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, right? In their business of hacking report, they actually identified ad fraud as the cybercrime with the most payout potential and the easiest one to put in place. So you can see, it's up there in the top right corner, the most prevalent cybercrime globally. And it actually has a tremendous financial cost. And this is actually estimated to be this year at $81 billion of cost for especially digital advertisers, which are the segment in the value chain that gets most affected by ad fraud. Right? Now, what does it entail? What is ad fraud particularly? Well, ad fraud is essentially the misrepresentation, the faking of a series of digital marketing events, digital advertising events, which happen along the whole funnel, and that fraudsters have been, masking and faking it for their own benefit or for the detriment of the advertiser. Typically, in an advertising funnel where we go from the impression down to the actual action from the prospective client or buyer, we can see different stages of the funnel that are affected by ad fraud, and it entails fake views at impression-based advertising. It entails fake clicks in everything that is PPC-based or pay-per-click campaigns. It also is represented by fake leads, so the generation of fake leads that are basically not human. And then also another example of conversion-based fraud, which is the fake installs. So basically, especially for app-based marketing. And this is, in general, caused by three main actors, which are bots, malware-initiated traffic, and also fake users. Now, what does it actually entail in terms of in practical terms, right? We've selected a couple of cases here that we'd like to present. There, probably those who have said yes, they probably know about these cases. They actually represent ad fraud very well from different parts of the advertising value chain. The first on the left that you can see is Uber. Uber has had probably the most famous lawsuit regarding ad fraud in the recent years, and probably in the history of advertising, probably, where they actually found out in 2017 that they were spending 150 million annually on advertising. And at some point, they realized that some of their partner apps were publishers for them. They were generating traffic and then generating installs for them. They started to see how they were driving a huge amount of installations for them. But the truth is that the monthly active users coming from those advertising operations, they were actually minimal, right? So they started actually uncovering a few very nasty fraud schemes of attribution fraud in that case, whereby a series of affiliates were faking the installs, or actually misattributing the installs from, there was either organic traffic, so that Uber should have never paid for this install, or that it could have even been attributed to other partners, so to other affiliates. So this was also a huge mess to their structure in their advertising structure. Right. So this is a very famous example from an advertiser perspective, the Uber lawsuit. There's also other very famous examples in other parts of the advertising value chain, and this is, of course, many of these cases also are uncovered or triggered by ad networks. Google Ads being the most famous one. They continuously run checks on publishers who are basically displaying ads on advertisers' behalf. And there was a very famous one in June 2020 where they ended up banning up to 30 apps, which were publishers for certain advertisers, due to basically fraudulent practices. These apps were illegitimately triggering advertising events like views, clicks, and conversions without necessarily the actual knowledge of the phone user that they could see. They were basically triggering a series of events that the advertisers were paying for, and that in the end, the specific advertiser was getting no benefit from it, right? The biggest example is when Uber actually cut those 2/3 of those 150 million in examples like this one. They actually saw absolutely no change to their advertising results, right? So essentially, those 2/3 were fake. Now, how does this affect the advertising ecosystem? It mostly affects advertisers, who are the ones who put in the money, and it affects them mainly in three ways. The first one is, of course, it depletes their budgets, and fraudsters will successfully capture, unless you have the right measures, they will successfully capture a share of that budget. Now, this will make it impossible for these companies to reach their objectives, their targets, right? Because they're basically taking into account that that money will be put to good practice and will be returning them, providing them a return, right? But through this, it won't. It's actually inflating their CAC. It's decreasing their ROAS, the return on advertising spend, and essentially, it's bringing down their revenues artificially, right? And then finally, it leaves the businesses who are doing digital advertising, leaves them with a chaos of data and skewed analytics. It's impossible to know which of your partners are actually bringing in the good revenue, the good leads, the good clicks, because essentially this is all there's a large percentage which is fake and tampered with. Now here we are including an example of the ad fraud money flow, and specifically also the actors behind it. We're going from left to right here in this chart, which basically showcases from an investment carried out by an advertiser, which is where the money originates. It actually flows through the hands of several segments or several partners, media partners, starting with the agency, right? That's the first player who let's say receives the advertising instructions, and then this goes on to demand side platforms, exchanges, supply side platforms, down to the very last publisher in the equation, right? What we can clearly see here is in this calculations from our industry benchmark is there is a part of that which can be, depending on the different campaigns, but it can range from 4 to 12% or even higher of these investments that are basically non-working media. This basically means it's an investment that is not paying out, and essentially it's ad fraud, right? So this is bots, this is fake users, and so on, right? And now, who does this? Who is actually creating? Who has the incentive to do this? Well, we see a few. Players in different segments that are incentivized in some way or another to actually create this ad fraud. We're talking about fraudulent publishers who, in the end, are getting their share of the click or the event or the install. That's the most clear case, as was in the Uber example we just saw. This, in many times, goes also. It happens thanks to the knowledge or the acknowledgement from fraudulent ad networks who might be looking the other way, as there could be, in some cases, certain ad networks are incentivized to basically also inflate numbers, right? So this part of that could also be affecting the final ad fraud. And these two players, publishers and ad networks, they are within your existing advertising operation, right? Within the advertiser's operation. So this is a very worrying thing, that the partners you're trusting, partners that advertisers are trusting, they are actually misrepresenting data, being untransparent, and generating ad fraud. And then also in some cases, a few cases of fraud schemes have been launched, usually at a lower scale by competitors. And usually, the structure of these fraudsters varies a lot. It can go from, let's say, more individual black hat marketers who have, the CEO, paid media knowledge to actually generate this ad fraud, or it could even also be at a larger scale, such as the example of organized crime, which is very typical, as we can imagine, click farms, lead farms, happening in large organizations with thousands of devices carrying out different attacks that we're seeing. Here we're presenting, I'd like to hand this over to Mark. Here we're presenting some of the very typical techniques that ad fraudsters are currently doing and that are very common nowadays. Mark, can we hear you?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's a list of the most common issues we see in most fraud schemes. Most common and most known case is the bot fraud. By bot, we understand any device that is actually non-physical devices, or either emulators or virtual devices that are used to generate massive amounts of traffic. And these bots are usually very sophisticated nowadays, and in some environments, especially on mobile, they are very hard to detect and to differentiate from real users, from real devices, as they copy the most features and behavior in a very sophisticated way. And okay, there's also others like geomasking. In the latest years, there's a big trend of services that allows fraudsters and other kind of fraudulent schemes to use those paid services to browse with residential proxies, to hide the origin of the traffic, to be able to skip targetings and to try to mask the real location of the device, so it cannot be tracked back. And others such as the adware or malware APKs. As Eduardo previously explained, there's not only bad APKs outside of the official stores. They are also in the official stores, like in the Google Play Store. We can see, even nowadays, we see in devices that are out of the factory and already contain adware and apps that are loading thousands of ads and browsing in the background in the touched services, and and stuff like that. So, and also the most typical cases such as non-visible ads, ads that are either out of the screen or are loaded in pixels, in very small pixel windows, and all that kind of stuff that cannot be visible by the user at the end of the day. So those applications, those bots are basically loading insane amounts of traffic in ways that the user will never be able to see.
Yes.
These are some of the most cases that we detect here at Opticks.
Essentially, this is different vulnerabilities within the advertising flows that the fraudsters are using to capture the budget, right? So some of the vulnerabilities and vehicles are common to other types of fraud that we've seen early today, and we will continue seeing. But they're put to very specific use also in advertising fraud. So, okay, we've set the atmosphere on what is ad fraud, but what can we do to detect it and prevent it? What ways do we have to do so? We'd like to share a few early symptoms first on, indicators that are actually signaling that there's something wrong with the advertising funnel. We've broken it down based on that funnel, so based on the click level, lead level, or essentially conversion level events. In terms of clicks, what we typically see, or what typically advertisers see when they can start to uncover ad fraud is high volume of clicks, but very low conversion rates, right? So there's fraudsters bringing in a very, very significant amount of these volumes in clicks, but they're actually not converting. So there's no return. That's a very obvious indicator.
Yeah, they basically do that to fly under the radar, to do not draw the attention with good grades, or to keep their numbers in a reasonable rate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We also see, in terms of fake clicks, the fact that they could be copious bounce rates. Many of these huge volumes of clicks actually will not be interacting with the pages or the products, and they'll actually be leaving. And what's very interesting is also the first early indicator is having a look at the distributions, and this happens in clicks, in leads, or any other events, is actually having a look at the distributions of those events across multiple dimensions. One of the easiest ones for advertisers to originally track is basically the IP. So seeing many clicks from same IPs could be an indicator that there is something wrong within your advertising operations. When it comes to leads, and this is typically from specific verticals, which are lead gen based verticals, a very clear example of potential fake leads is unusually high percentage of conversion rates, but also the opposite. So actually the opposites are having very low conversions from those leads onto the sales, right? Because they're basically low quality leads, or even low engagement rates in freemium models whenever there's open products. And specifically, this is one that we see a lot from advertisers starting to fight fraud, which has to do with complaints from colleagues and teammates and partners about lead quality, right? In many cases, with the example of how to target paid leads. And then suddenly, when it comes to attributions, we've indicated here a few. The first three have to do with sudden spikes in attributed sales from specific partners. For instance, a new partner that suddenly is getting attributed a lot of those sales. That's a very clear indicator. And the opposite, older partners who have seen a sudden decrease in those attributions. It could be a trade-off, particularly with the attribution fraud. And a couple of other examples when it comes to installs, as the Uber case, low user engagement compared to the install levels, and when it comes to sales, especially e-commerce, delivery players, etc., high chargeback rates.
In those cases, usually when the product is profitable enough from the fraudster point of view. If the sometimes it can also be a big trigger if the flow changes, the attribution process changes, and then the installs or the attributions drop dramatically. It means that there was a specific fraud scheme attacking that kind of process.
Exactly, from some automated scheme attacking those flows. Yes. And well, basically, how can an advertiser, how can any player in the value chain fight it? The way we see it is there's only one proven way to actually tackle ad fraud, and this is how we present the fraud prevention function, right? Fraud prevention function for us is a mix of three main things that help effectively and in a proven way fight and beat ad fraud. And it basically entails creating a series of processes that work together to study the fraud continuously, ongoing throughout the year, in order to put a stop to it. That has to do with meetings. It has to do with objectives. It has to do with ownership of this process, and this all has to happen through a committee or through a group of people, which in most cases come from different sets of the organization, mostly marketing or advertising, but also potentially sales, potentially finance, potentially growth and analytics, and that they work together to actually put a stop from the different perspectives. And of course, this all does not work if we have the processes, we have the people in the committee, we still lack systems. And systems actually, of course, ad fraud prevention solution is the central part, but it needs to be very well integrated, communicated with other systems to prevent fraud, namely CMSs, CRMs, analytics, etc. All of these pieces are very important pieces of the puzzle to beat ad fraud, and together they allow advertisers and other players in the industry to beat ad fraud. Now, when looking at solutions, now this has a bit more to do with a couple of tips. Probably you'll want to look at of course, reputed solutions, and these are 4 of the key areas that we consider that advertisers will need to look at. So basically, detection, making sure that the detection is independent and reliable, both things. That there are a series of modules also on the second step to actually prevent it in real time, as automated as possible. It will help fight fraud much quicker. So automated blacklistings, real-time traffic enforcement, etc., etc. Intelligence. It's not only about detecting and preventing it, but actually having the right tools to analyze it and get the visibility and quality of that performance. And then last, measurement, a true measurement of the different events, advertising events in the flow. Just to now wrap it up, there's a couple of pieces that we've developed that might be relevant to those interested in the subjects, particularly how to implement this fraud prevention function, and also on the right-hand side, how to choose the right solutions to help you fight ad fraud. This would be all for us.